Do you ever get so mad that you walk to church in the middle of the night by yourself to pray?
Yeah, me neither.
But for Arlis Perry, that was a different story. After getting into a fight with her husband, Arliss walked to church where she was brutally slain in what appeared to be some sort of cult-like ritual.
Yeah, you may want to grab some sage to burn after this because this story is spooky.
On the morning of October 13th, 1974, a Stanford University security officer was making his usual rounds when he noticed something strange.
One of the doors to the church on campus had been unlocked. He was a bit on edge when he walked inside, but as he started to look around, he didn't see anything missing and saw the altar looked intact.
And that's when he turned his head and found the body of 19-year-old Arlis Perry.
Arliss's corpse was discovered near the altar, and she wasn't wearing any pants either. Based on that, I'm sure you can tell some awful stuff went down, and this definitely wasn't an accident. The security guard, Steven, immediately picked up his phone and called the police, where he told dispatchers, "Hey, we've got a stiff here."
After the call was made, officers showed up at the scene to check things out.
As soon as they saw the setup, officials knew they were dealing with a super demented perp who may have performed this act as some sort of satanic ritual.
So Arliss's body was found lying face up with her hands folded across her torso. There was an ice pick sticking out of her head, a candle lying on her chest, and neck injuries that suggested loss of air.
Her clothes had been taken off from the waist down, and she appeared to have suffered some bodily damage to her lower half from a 30-inch altar candle.
Some reports claim the girl's pants were strategically staged in a diamond pattern across her legs,
and other reports state her legs were in a bent and open position with her pants around her ankles. But either way, detectives immediately noticed a shape from her legs or pants that looked an awful lot like a pentagram.
And that was one of the key reasons they immediately jumped to the Satan worshiper theory.
This also went down in the church, so that speculation already seems pretty solid at this point.
The two main pieces of evidence investigators found at the scene were a latent handprint that was found on one of the altar candles and a sample of male DNA that was recovered from a nearby pillow.
So as you can tell, what happened to Arliss was bad. But why would someone want to do something like this to an innocent young woman? Maybe she wasn't as innocent as everyone thought? Well, let's take a closer look at her life leading up to this point to find out. Arliss grew up in North Dakota, where she was raised in a pretty sheltered Christian home.
She was described by most people as positive, happy, and a bit naive.
Arliss met her high school sweetheart Bruce and followed him out to Palo Alto, California after a short period of doing the whole long distance thing, which I don't blame her for going out there because long distance sucks.
So the reason Bruce moved out west was because he was pursuing a pre-med degree at Stanford University.
At the time of the move, Arliss was attending community college in North Dakota and Bruce hadn't proposed yet, so they decided to date at a distance.
Well, about a year into their long-distance relationship, Bruce and Arliss decided to get married, which meant she could finally live with her hubby in California.
When Arliss first moved out to the West Coast, she experienced a bit of a culture shock. As I mentioned earlier, she grew up in a very nice area with protective parents, so she wasn't really exposed to all sides of the world. This was also in the 70s, so I'm sure she had quite the time adjusting to the flower power culture of liberal California.
Arliss's transition to California was also a bit rough because she had a tough go at making friends.
But with the help of the beautiful Stanford campus, which Arliss and Bruce lived on, and her new receptionist job, Arliss started to feel more comfortable calling Palo Alto her home. Even still, Arliss was super tight with her friends and family back home, and she wrote them pretty often. On her last night alive, Arliss wanted to drop off some letters to her fam. It was pretty late at night, and Bruce didn't want his young wife walking around alone, so he came with her.
The couple left their apartment to go on a walk at 11:30. Along the way, Arliss and Bruce got into a bit of a fight over their car, but it didn't seem too serious.
Apparently, one of the car tires had low pressure, so they were fighting over who was responsible for pumping it up. So based on what I know, it kind of seems like Bruce was stressed out about school and Arliss was craving attention from her busy husband. They were also probably past the honeymoon stage, so I'm sure they were figuring out the dynamics of everything.
But on the other hand, this fight happened on the night before Arliss was found lifeless in the church.
So maybe Bruce was so fed up with his wife and so overwhelmed with school that he snapped?
Well, after the tiff, Arliss told Bruce she was going to walk over to the church alone so she could pray and calm herself down.
Well, Bruce headed back to the apartment and waited up for Arliss to pray her mad away. When 12:30 rolled around, Arliss still wasn't home and Bruce started to get concerned.
He decided to swing by the church to retrieve his wife, but when he got there, the doors were locked and Arliss was nowhere in sight.
Bruce didn't have a good feeling about all this because he knew his wife didn't really have any friends, so he thought to himself, it's not like she went to see someone else.
Since he couldn't get into the church, Bruce started searching the surrounding area to see if Arliss had run off to a different area on campus.
After frantically running around campus looking for his wife, Bruce went back to his apartment and called the cops to fill them in on the sitch. This was around 3 a.m.
He hoped Arliss had just fallen asleep in the church and accidentally got locked in, but knew something way worse could have happened.
Well, whatever happened, officers didn't seem that concerned because when they showed up to look for Arliss, the church doors were still locked and they didn't bother opening them.
Instead, they just casually strolled around the perimeter of the building and were like, yeah, we don't see her, but she should be fine.
And a little over 2 hours later, she wasn't fine. At 5:45 in the morning, Stephen found one of the church doors unlocked, which officials later determined to have been forced open. Stephen walked inside, spotted a lifeless Arliss by the altar, and called 911. When the cops showed up at the scene this time, they took the case much more seriously. If only they showed up with that energy when Bruce first called them.
Once Arliss was identified, officials showed up at Bruce's apartment to give him the awful news.
But when Bruce opened the door, he was covered in red fluid.
Bruce told the cops he gets chronic nosebleeds when he's stressed out, so he claimed it was his own fluid.
And later, once tests were conducted, this theory was confirmed as the stain matched Bruce's DNA. Obviously, Bruce still sounds pretty sus at this point, and detectives thought the same thing, so they gave him a polygraph test.
He stuck with the story that he went on a walk with his wife, got into an argument with her, and walked home alone while she went to the church.
And it all added up with the timeline of him calling the cops later that evening.
After spilling the tea on everything he knew, Bruce passed the polygraph test, and he wasn't a match for the handprint or pillow DNA, so he was ruled out as a suspect.
But Bruce wasn't the last person who reportedly saw Arliss. Once she made the decision to get her post-argument Jesus fix, 2 witnesses mentioned seeing Arliss enter the church just as they were about to leave.
Right around the time the couple left, they said some other dude entered the church. Oh, so maybe that dude is the one who did this to Arliss.
I mean, I don't know of many college kids who willingly go to church in general, let alone on a Saturday night when parties are popping.
The witnesses were able to get a pretty good glance of their guy who went to the church after Arliss.
They said the dude was wearing a blue short-sleeved t-shirt, had blonde hair, and looked to be under 25 years old. So basically, we're looking for every single frat dude on campus. That really narrows it down.
At 12:10 in the morning, Stephen came back to the church to lock it up for the night.
He didn't see anyone inside, but gave a quick shout to let people know he was locking the doors in case there was a straggler.
And when no one responded, Stephen assumed the Lord's house had been emptied for the night, so he locked all the doors.
He told the cops that he went by a few more times throughout his shift that night and didn't notice anything suspicious. He even claimed he looked inside the church at 2 a.m. to conduct a routine checkup before locking it up again. And that's when detectives started to suspect Stephen as the perp.
This is because they had already determined Arliss was knocked out right after midnight. If Stephen walked through the church at 2 and didn't see Arliss, that meant her attacker was either able to hide themselves in Arliss without Stephen knowing, or Stephen was lying to cover something up.
And there are plenty of reasons Stephen could have wanted to cover something up. He may have been responsible for the slaying, or maybe he was just slacking off at work that night and made up the story to make it seem like he was actually doing his job.
So at the moment, Stephen seemed like the main guy, but as you may or may not remember, when investigators searched the scene,
they determined the door had been forced open. But it was forced open from the inside.
Now, if Stephen was a security guard and had all the keys to these buildings, it wouldn't make sense that he was the one who rubbed out Arliss.
He was later determined to not be a match for the handprint or DNA found at the scene. And based on the way everything looked at the crime scene, officials theorized that the perp may have stayed in the church with Arliss for hours before getting scared away when the cops walked around the building at 3 a.m. So who is this mysterious person?
Well, authorities believe the crime was premeditated since the villain had an ice pick with them.
Wait. No one else goes into a church at midnight with an ice pick in their hand?
On the real, that's super sketchy, and based on how gruesome the scene was, it wouldn't make sense for the attacker to be a random person either.
Remember though, Arliss still doesn't really have any friends, so this left detectives stumped.
But the girl was often described as pretty naive, so maybe there was someone she met in passing that picked up on this and started stalking her.
And that's when one of Arliss's new coworkers came forward to provide a new lead. The day before the incident, this coworker mentioned seeing a man pay Arliss a visit. The coworker never met Bruce, so he thought the visitor was Arliss's husband.
But after seeing Bruce at the funeral, he knew something was up.
The coworker told officials that the man who came to see Arliss that day definitely wasn't her husband.
He said the dude was blonde, young, and looked super athletic.
The mystery man approached Arliss, had a serious-looking conversation with her that lasted about 15 minutes, and left.
Arliss's coworker didn't ask about it after the fact because he said it looked so serious. He also just started working with her, so I'm sure he wasn't trying to be all up in her grill like that.
Since the description of Arliss's office guest matched up with the one of the guy who entered the church after Arliss, a lot of people who followed the case thought this was the same man and believed he was responsible for the crime. But investigators didn't do much digging on the potential perp and were never actually able to find out his identity. In their defense, basically every male on the Stanford campus matched that description. After interviewing Chad number 5, they were probably so over it and just dropped the lead. Arliss was eventually sent back to North Dakota, where she was laid to rest in her hometown. But less than 2 weeks after the girl was buried, the temporary grave marker at her burial site was stolen.
Now, this could have been from some random hooligan running around the cemetery, but since none of the other graves were tampered with, some people theorized Arliss's attacker was actually from her hometown.
Not everyone got behind this idea though, because that would mean the suspect had to travel all the way to California to commit the crime and then come all the way back to North Dakota, which would be quite the extravagant itinerary. Yeah, they would have to fly to San Jose, get a ride to Palo Alto, find an ice pick somewhere, and post up at the church. And then after everything was said and done, they'd have to pack up and fly back. Well, I guess they could have driven, but still, it's extra.
At this point, a lot of people still believe the perp was either Stephen or Bruce, but that wasn't the case for everyone.
Some people thought Arliss was slain by David Berkowitz, more commonly known as the son of Sam. This is because he sent a book to authorities in 1979 with writing in the margins that said Arlis Perry, hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California, Stanford University.
Well, that seems like a confession to me.
But for some reason, it must have not been entertained by detectives because no conviction has been made. Other followers of the case believe the perp could have been the Zodiac Killer, a Freemason, some Satan-loving cult member, or my favorite, a random flute player from Arliss's church who some say was in the church that night. For over 40 years, the case remained unsolved, but in 2018, the perp was finally found. Thanks to new technology, officials were able to determine that Stephen's DNA was a match for a sample recovered from a piece of Arliss's clothing. As soon as the cops showed up at Stephen's house with a warrant, he locked his door, grabbed a pistol, and ended it all.
Even though there wasn't a trial for obvious reasons, most people believe Stephen really was the perp.
I mean, I don't know how many innocent people would take their own life like that. But then again, there were still many holes in the Stephen theory. So now I'll toss it to you. Who do you think snuffed Arliss? For me, I'm still unsure, but I kind of want to roll with the flute player for now. Speaking of roll, these spring rolls are ready to go.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and be sure to keep an eye out for ice pick wielding creeps.